There are rules to magic that most people don't understand. It's not about waving wands or chanting in Latin. Real magic, the kind that actually works, follows patterns. 3 specific patterns. And when someone masters all 3 at once, when they weave them together like threads in expensive silk, that's when things get truly dangerous. I learned this from a bartender in Billings, Montana, who watched those 3 elegant spells destroy everything a man thought he controlled. My name's Jason Fox, and I've been pouring drinks in bars across America for over 2 decades. I've heard thousands of stories, but there are some that you just can't forget. This is one of those. Before we continue, I'd like to know, what state are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or state in the comments below. I love knowing these stories reach people all across the country. All right, back to that night. Everett Barlow walked into the Whistling Elk on a Tuesday in October 2019, which is how I first heard about him. The bar sat on the north side of Billings, not quite downtown but not suburban either, in that gray zone where the city hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. The owner, a guy I knew from my years working in Louisville, had called me up desperate for someone who could handle the evening shift. I'd been between gigs anyway, so Montana seemed as good as anywhere. Everett wasn't a regular when I started, but within 2 weeks he might as well have been. Mid-50s, always in clothes that looked expensive without trying to show it. Wool blazers in charcoal or navy, shirts with French cuffs. The kind of guy who wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars but never once checked the time on it. He had this way of sitting at the bar, elbows never quite touching the wood, spine perfectly straight, like someone had taught him posture mattered more than comfort. What struck me about Everett wasn't his money or his manners. It was how he watched people. Not in a creepy way. More like someone studying a painting, trying to understand the brushstrokes. He'd nurse a single bourbon for 2 hours, the ice melting into pale amber, while his eyes tracked every conversation in the room. His fingers would tap the bar in these precise little rhythms: 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. I noticed it because I'm a drummer, used to be anyway, and his tempo never varied. The first strange thing happened on a Thursday night in early November. The bar was half full, mostly regulars. Everett sat in his usual spot at the end, on his second bourbon now, which meant something was off. A couple sat 3 stools down from him, young professionals, mid-20s maybe. They'd been arguing in tight whispers for 20 minutes. The kind of fight where you're trying not to make a scene, but the rage bleeds through anyway. The woman kept saying something about trust, about promises broken, her voice getting sharper with each repetition. Everett leaned forward slightly. His fingers stopped their tapping. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what looked like a business card, cream-colored heavy stock. He slid it down the bar toward the couple with just enough force that it stopped exactly between them. They both looked at it, then at him. Everett smiled, this warm, grandfatherly expression that somehow made his eyes look colder. He said something I couldn't hear from where I stood at the other end of the bar. The couple picked up the card, read it, and their whole demeanor changed. The tension drained out of their shoulders. The woman's face, which had been tight with anger, went slack. They stood up together, left cash on the bar for their drinks plus a generous tip, and walked out holding hands. They moved in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly, like dancers who'd rehearsed the choreography 1,000 times. I wiped down their section after they left. The card was still there, face down. When I flipped it over, it was blank. Just expensive cream cardstock with nothing written on either side. The texture felt wrong though, like running your fingers over braille. Raised patterns that your eyes couldn't see but your skin could sense. Everett caught me looking at the card and smiled that same warm, cold smile. He told me some people just need permission to make the choice they've already decided on. The card, he explained, simply gave them that permission. I laughed, made some joke about being a therapist as a side gig. But his smile didn't change, and something in my chest tightened. Over the next 3 weeks, Everett pulled that same move 6 more times. Always with couples or groups who were arguing, always sliding a blank card, always with that smile. And every single time, the people's behavior shifted instantly. The rage or frustration or whatever negative emotion had been controlling them just evaporated. They'd leave peaceful, synchronized, moving in ways that seemed rehearsed despite being spontaneous. The second strange thing started in December. Billings gets cold that time of year, the kind of cold that makes your face ache. The Whistling Elk stayed busy because nobody wanted to be outside. and Everett had expanded his routine. He'd started talking to solo patrons now, people drinking alone, the ones who looked like they carried weight they couldn't put down. I'm talking about the divorced guy staring at his phone's photo gallery, the woman who'd order wine and write furiously in a notebook, the college kid home for break who seemed lost in his own city. Everett would sit next to them, not in a pushy way. He'd just migrate down the bar until he was in the adjacent seat. Then he'd start talking about patterns, about how human behavior follows rhythms we don't notice, how most of our problems come from fighting against our natural frequency instead of harmonizing with it. His voice had this quality, smooth and measured, like expensive whiskey going down. People would lean in, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Then came the second spell, though I didn't know to call it that yet. Everett would take out a small leather notebook, the kind with a strap that wrapped around it twice, and he'd write something down. 3 lines, always 3 lines, his pen moving in these elegant loops and curves. He'd tear out the page, fold it 3 times into a small square, and hand it to the person he'd been talking to. He'd tell them to put it in their pocket and not look at it until they got home, but to make sure they looked at it before they went to sleep. I watched this happen 15, maybe 20 times before Christmas. Each person would take the folded paper with reverence, like receiving a prescription from a doctor they trusted completely. They'd thank Everett profusely, sometimes with tears in their eyes, and leave the bar with their posture changed, shoulders back, chin up, purpose in their stride. I got curious. Started asking regulars if they'd seen any of these people again, the ones Everett had helped. Nobody had. Not the divorced guy, not the notebook woman, not the lost college kid. None of them ever came back to the Whistling Elk. At first I thought maybe Everett had solved their problem so completely they no longer needed the comfort of a bar. But Billings isn't that big a city. In a place like this you see the same faces eventually, even if you're not looking for them. Their complete absence felt deliberate, like they'd been edited out of the local population. The third spell appeared right after New Year's. January in Montana is brutal, this oppressive gray that settles over everything like a heavy curtain. The bar's clientele shifted, less casual drinkers, more people seeking refuge from something they couldn't articulate. Everett seemed energized by this, more animated than I'd seen him. His bourbon consumption increased to 3 glasses a night, but he never showed any signs of intoxication. If anything, he got sharper, more focused, his eyes tracking multiple conversations simultaneously, like he was conducting an orchestra only he could hear. This is when he started with the coins. Old coins, the kind collectors pay serious money for. Silver dollars from the 1800s, buffalo nickels, mercury dimes. He carried them loose in his pocket, and you could hear them clicking together when he walked, this soft metallic whisper. When someone at the bar would complain about their life, their job, their circumstances, Everett would produce one of these coins and place it on the bar in front of them. The ritual was always the same. He'd tell them to flip the coin 3 times. Heads meant yes, tails meant no, but he never specified what question they were answering. The person would flip, and Everett would watch the coin spin with intense concentration, his lips moving slightly like he was counting or maybe praying. After the third flip, regardless of the result, Everett would tell them to keep the coin. He'd say something about how the metal remembered their touch now, how it would help them make the right choices going forward. People treasured those coins. I saw grown men cup them in their palms like they'd been handed holy relics. Women would clutch them tight enough that their knuckles went white. The coins seemed to hum, though that might have been my imagination, a sound right at the edge of hearing that made your teeth ache. The first plot twist came on a frozen Tuesday in late January. One of Everett's coin recipients came back to the bar, a middle-aged woman named Cheryl Hastings who worked as a CPA for one of the bigger firms in Billings. She'd been given a coin 3 weeks earlier after complaining about a partnership offer she wasn't sure about. Now she was back and she looked wrong. Her skin had this waxy quality like a mannequin, and her movements were too smooth, lacking the small imperfections that make humans human. No fidgeting, no adjusting her clothes, no unconscious touches to her face or hair. She walked straight up to Everett and placed the coin back on the bar. She thanked him for the clarity but said she didn't need it anymore. Her voice was flat, emotionless, like reading a script she'd memorized but didn't understand. Everett's face went dark for just a moment. a flash of something predatory before his usual warm smile returned. He told her that was wonderful, that he was so pleased it had helped. He picked up the coin, and the moment his fingers touched it, Cheryl gasped. Her entire body shuddered, and suddenly she looked normal again. Confused, disoriented, but human. She blinked rapidly, glanced around the bar like she'd just woken up in an unfamiliar place, then hurried out without another word. I approached Everett after she left, asked what that was about. He swirled his bourbon, the ice clinking against crystal, and told me that sometimes people have trouble adjusting to clarity, that when you remove the fog of confusion and doubt from someone's life, they can find the sharpness uncomfortable. Some need to return to the blur to feel normal again. His explanation made sense in the way that dreams make sense. Logical within their own framework, but completely wrong when you think about it in daylight. February brought a snowstorm that lasted 5 days. The city essentially shut down, and the Whistling Elk became one of the few places still open, more out of stubbornness than good sense. The handful of customers who made it in were desperate for warmth and company, and Everett was there every single night, a constant presence like the bar's furniture. His 3 spells, as I'd started thinking of them, were in full rotation. Cards for the conflicted, folded papers for the lost, coins for the uncertain. He moved between them with a performer's timing, always knowing exactly which spell a person needed before they'd even finished explaining their problem. I started noticing things, small details that didn't add up. The way Everett never seemed to arrive or leave, he was just suddenly there at the bar or suddenly gone. How his bourbon never actually decreased in the glass despite him drinking from it. The fact that his coat, even on the coldest nights, never had snow on it when he walked in. And there were his fingers, those precise tapping rhythms that I realized weren't random at all, but following the same pattern as his spells. 3 beats. Always 3. Like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. The second plot twist hit me on a Saturday night in mid-February. I was cashing out for the evening, counting the till, when I found 3 of Everett's coins mixed in with the regular quarters and dimes. Except these coins were different. The faces on them had changed. Instead of the historical figures and symbolic images that should have been there, each coin showed a portrait I recognized. The divorced guy who'd been one of Everett's first coin recipients. The notebook woman. The lost college kid. Their faces, captured in silver relief, with expressions of absolute serenity. My hands started shaking. I looked up, and Everett was standing on the other side of the bar. I hadn't heard him approach. His warm smile was in place, but his eyes were completely empty, like looking into wells that had no bottom. He reached across and gently took the coins from my trembling fingers. He told me I'd been doing excellent work, that the Whistling Elk had never run better, and that I'd earned something special. He placed a card, a folded paper, and a coin in front of me, one of each, the complete set. He said I'd been observing so carefully, surely I'd figured out what they really meant by now. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up. Everett leaned forward, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of cedar and smoke. He whispered that the 3 spells were gifts. The card gave permission to stop pretending. The paper gave direction when you had none. The coin gave decisiveness when you were trapped by choices. Together, they did something much more elegant. They gave peace. Permanent, unbreakable, absolute peace. The kind you could only find by surrendering the messy, chaotic burden of independent thought. I knocked the offerings onto the floor, stepped back so hard I hit the wall of bottles behind the bar. Several fell shattering, bourbon and vodka and gin mixing on the floor in pools that caught the dim lighting and looked almost like spilled oil. Everett didn't move, just maintained that smile and those empty eyes. He told me it was my choice, that magic always required consent, and that I could refuse if I really wanted to keep struggling through my cluttered, confused existence. He left the coins and card and paper on the floor where they'd fallen and walked toward the door. No coat, though it was below 0 outside. He paused at the entrance, his hand on the brass handle, and looked back at me. He said the 3 spells worked best as a set, but they could work individually too. He said I'd already handled all 3 tonight just by picking up those coins from the till. The exposure had started. Soon I'd crave the clarity they offered. It was only a matter of time before I came looking for him to finish what had been initiated. Then he was gone. No opening door. No blast of cold air. just suddenly absent from a space he'd been occupying a second before. I should have quit that night. Should have walked out of the Whistling Elk and never come back. But rent doesn't pay itself, and winter jobs in Billings aren't easy to come by. I told myself I'd imagined the worst of it. Exhaustion, stress, maybe the fumes from all that spilled alcohol had gotten to me. I convinced myself it was just a weird guy with boundary issues, that the coins with faces were a trick of the light, or my tired eyes creating patterns that weren't there. The third plot twist came through the door on a Wednesday in early March. A detective from the Billings Police Department, plainclothes but obviously law enforcement from the way he scanned the room before approaching the bar. His name was Seth Compton, and he had pictures, 23 photographs of people who'd been reported missing over the past 4 months. He spread them across the bar top like cards in a game of solitaire and asked if I recognized any of them. I recognized all of them. Every single face had sat at this bar. Every single one had talked to Everett Barlow. Every single one had received at least one of the 3 spells. Detective Compton explained that the missing persons cases had a strange pattern. The people hadn't vanished suddenly. They'd gradually withdrawn from their lives, stopped showing up to work, stopped calling friends and family, stopped participating in their own existence. When family members finally got worried enough to check on them, the people were simply gone. Apartments empty but not cleared out. Cars still in driveways. Bank accounts untouched, like they'd stepped out of their lives and evaporated into something that wasn't quite air. I told him about Everett, about the cards and papers and coins, about the 3 spells he'd been casting on anyone willing to receive them. Compton wrote everything down, his pen moving in quick, efficient strokes. When I finished, he asked if I had any of the items Everett had distributed. I remembered the ones still on the floor from where I'd knocked them away. But when we looked, they were gone. The bourbon and vodka and gin had been cleaned up, the glass shards removed, though I knew I hadn't touched the mess, and there was no sign of the card or paper or coin. Compton gave me his number and told me to call if Everett showed up again. He also told me something that made my blood cold. He'd been investigating these disappearances for 2 months, and in that time, 3 other people had come forward with similar stories. A bartender in Missoula, a waitress in Great Falls, a hotel concierge in Helena, all describing the same man, same 3 spells, same elegant, predatory approach to helping people. The pattern went back years, moving from city to city across Montana like a slow-moving storm. Everett didn't come back to the Whistling Elk for 3 weeks. March warmed slightly, snow melting into gray slush, and the bar filled with people celebrating the approaching end of winter. I'd almost convinced myself it was over, that he'd moved on to another city, another bar, another collection of lost souls to harvest. Then, on the first day of spring, he walked in like he'd never left. Same clothes, same smile, same bourbon order. He sat at his usual spot and looked at me with those empty eyes. He said he'd heard I'd been talking to the police, that I'd been spreading stories about magic and disappearances. He said he was disappointed. He'd thought I was smarter than that, observant enough to understand what he was really offering. The 3 spells weren't predatory, he explained. They were merciful. Every single person who'd accepted his help had been drowning in their own confusion, paralyzed by the impossible burden of free will. He'd simply offered them a way out. The 4th plot twist was sitting 2 stools away from Everett. Detective Compton, dressed in civilian clothes, nursing a beer and pretending not to listen. He'd been staking out the bar for the past week, waiting for Everett to return. Now he stood, badge in hand, and started to approach. Everett moved faster than should have been possible. His hand flashed into his jacket and emerged with something that looked like a coin, but felt wrong to look at, the metal seeming to bend light around it. He flipped it once, caught it, and slapped it down on the bar with a sound like a gunshot. Detective Compton froze mid-step, his body going rigid. His face lost all expression, eyes going distant and glassy. Everett smiled at him and said 3 words I couldn't quite hear, each syllable sharp and crystalline like breaking ice. Compton turned and walked out of the bar. His movements were mechanical, puppet-like, controlled by strings I couldn't see. Everett watched him go, then looked at me and shook his head. He said law enforcement always complicated things unnecessarily. They couldn't understand that some forms of magic were actually kindness, wearing an unfamiliar shape. That's when I understood the true scope of what I was dealing with. The 3 spells weren't separate tricks. They were a system, a complete methodology for rewriting human will. The card dissolved resistance. The paper implanted direction. The coin sealed the transformation. Each spell was elegant on its own, but together they formed something devastating, a way to take a person's messy, painful, beautiful autonomy and replace it with perfect, peaceful obedience. I asked Everett who he was. Not his name, which I already knew, but what he was. Where he'd learned this magic, why he was doing it, what happened to the people who accepted his help. He finished his bourbon, the glass somehow full again despite him drinking from it, and told me a story. He'd been a psychiatrist once back in the 1970s. Worked in an institution outside of Butte, one of those places where they sent people who'd broken in ways society couldn't fix. He'd spent 30 years listening to humans describe their suffering, watching them tear themselves apart with indecision, anxiety, trauma, all the psychological weight that consciousness carries. He'd tried every approved method to help them. Therapy, medication, behavioral modification. Nothing worked. Not really. The best he could do was dull the pain slightly, make the burden a little more bearable. Then he'd met someone, another doctor, older, who'd shown him different approaches, techniques that didn't come from medical textbooks but from older sources. Books written in languages that hadn't been spoken in centuries. Methods that required specific materials and precise execution. Magic, though they didn't call it that at first. They called it advanced neurological intervention, reframing the neural pathways through external sympathetic resonance. Academic language hiding ancient truth. Everett and this other doctor experimented for years, refining their techniques on willing patients who'd exhausted all other options. The 3 spells emerged from that work. 3 elegant solutions to the 3 core problems of human suffering. Confusion about identity, lack of purpose, paralysis when facing decisions. Solve those 3 problems, Everett explained, and you eliminate the root cause of almost all psychological distress. The cost, he admitted, was what most people would call the self. But he argued the self was just a story we told ourselves anyway, a narrative construction that caused more pain than it provided meaning. His spells didn't destroy people. They freed them from the prison of their own consciousness, gave them the peace that comes from finally, completely, letting go. I asked what happened to them after. After they'd been given all 3 spells. After their identity and purpose and decisiveness had been externally provided. Where did they go? Everett's smile widened, showing too many teeth, and he said they went where they were needed. There were places in the world, he explained, where willing, peaceful, obedient people were valuable. Places that asked no questions and kept no records. His patients, as he still called them, found homes in those places, found purpose in service that required no thought or choice or struggle. The 5th plot twist was my own realization, sharp and sudden as a blade. I'd been handling Everett's coins every night for weeks, the ones mixed in with the regular till. My fingers had touched them dozens of times, absorbing whatever subtle magic they carried through repeated exposure. I could feel it now that I knew to look for it, a warm pressure behind my eyes, a constant low hum in my thoughts like tinnitus but melodic, the first spell working on me slowly, dissolving my resistance one shift at a time. My hands were shaking again. I asked Everett if that was intentional, if he'd been poisoning me gradually all winter. He looked genuinely offended. He said he never forced his gifts on anyone. The coins in the till were there because his patients sometimes gave them back, like Cheryl Hastings had, and the coins naturally found their way into circulation. If I'd been affected, it was only because somewhere deep down, I wanted to be. The spells only worked on people who carried the right kind of suffering, the kind that made them secretly crave an end to choice. I told him to get out, to take his 3 elegant spells and his empty promises of peace and never come back to the Whistling Elk. Everett stood slowly, adjusted his jacket with precise, practiced movements. He left cash on the bar for his bourbon, a crisp $100 bill that was probably older than I was. He told me I'd change my mind eventually. They always did, he said. Once the exposure had progressed far enough, once the noise in my head got loud enough, I'd come looking for him. He'd be waiting. He'd have my card, my paper, my coin ready whenever I was ready to receive them. He walked toward the door, and this time I watched carefully. He did open it. Cold March air did rush in, but something about the way he moved through the doorway seemed wrong, like watching a video with frames missing, his position jumping from inside to outside without transitioning through the space between. The sixth plot twist arrived by mail 3 days later. An envelope addressed to me at the bar, heavy paper with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed Detective Seth Compton standing in what looked like an industrial kitchen, wearing white coveralls, his face completely blank. Behind him were rows of other people in identical outfits, all with that same empty expression. The back of the photo had a single sentence written in elegant script. He found his purpose. I should have burned the photograph. Instead, I kept it, tucked it into the pocket of my work shirt and carried it like a talisman or maybe a warning. I started researching, spending my days off at the library digging through old newspaper archives and public records. The pattern was bigger than Montana. Everett Barlow, or whoever he really was, had been moving through small cities across the American West for decades. Different names sometimes, but always the same description, same methodology, same trail of disappearances that law enforcement could never quite connect into a recognizable pattern. The oldest mention I found was from 1983 in a Bozeman newspaper, an article about a psychiatrist from the state hospital who died in a fire. Dr. Everett Barlow, survived by no one, mourned by his grateful patients. Except I'd been serving bourbon to that same man just days ago. Either he'd faked his death 40 years earlier, or something far stranger was happening. I found references to the other doctor he'd mentioned, Dr. Marcus Fenwick, who'd worked at the same institution and disappeared in 1981, last seen checking out several rare books from the hospital's medical library. Books on neurology and psychology, but also on folklore, religious practices, something called sympathetic magic. The books were never returned. Fenwick was never found. The investigation went nowhere. The final major plot twist came when I found Fenwick's dissertation from 1954. It was buried in University of Montana's digital archives, a doctoral thesis titled Neurological Resonance and the Surrender of Individual Will, a cross-cultural study of ritual possession. 300 pages of academic language describing how various cultures had developed methods for what he called consensual consciousness displacement, ways to help people surrender their sense of self to larger purposes, using objects imbued with specific meanings through repeated ritual use. Fenwick argued this wasn't mind control because it required the subject's cooperation at a deep level. The person had to truly want to let go, had to be suffering enough that peace at any cost seemed preferable to continued autonomy. The objects used in these rituals, cards and papers and coins in his examples, were just focusing tools. The real magic was in the pattern, the three-step process that matched, he claimed, the three fundamental aspects of human consciousness: identity, purpose, agency. At the bottom of the last page, in handwritten ink that had faded but was still legible, was a note. Successfully field tested. Results exceed expectations. Subject remains in harmonious state 6 months post-application. Proceeding to expanded trials with EB's assistance. I understood then. Everett and Fenwick had turned academic theory into practical magic. They'd found a way to weaponize psychiatric intervention, to dress up the complete destruction of self in the language of healing and help. And they'd been doing it for 70 years, moving from place to place, leaving trails of peaceful, purposeful, obedient people in their wake. The question was why? What did they gain from it? The photograph of Detective Compton suggested a destination for their patients, but what was the purpose of that industrial kitchen, those rows of empty-faced workers? Who was receiving all these people Everett had helped into oblivion? I never got to answer that question. The decision got taken out of my hands on a Tuesday in early April. I came into work to find the Whistling Elk had been sold. New owner, immediate transfer, staff being retained but under new management. The new owner walked in during my shift and my blood turned to ice water. Dr. Marcus Fenwick looked exactly like his 1954 university ID photo. Same face, same age, same unsettling eyes that saw through you instead of at you. He shook my hand, his grip cold and firm, and told me he'd heard excellent things about my work. He'd be taking a hands-on approach to operations, would be at the bar most evenings, looked forward to working with me closely. His smile was Everett's smile, warm on the surface and empty underneath. That night, I walked out of the Whistling Elk and never went back. Didn't collect my final paycheck, didn't return my key, just left. I threw away my work shirt with the photograph still in its pocket. I scrubbed my hands until the skin turned red, trying to remove any residue of magic from the coins I'd been handling. I don't know if it worked. I still feel that warm pressure behind my eyes sometimes, that melodic hum in my thoughts that wants me to stop questioning, stop struggling, stop holding on to this messy consciousness that causes so much pain. I left Montana entirely, ended up in Baltimore, then wound my way through various cities, never staying long enough to establish patterns. I look for Everett sometimes, that particular quality of charm that hides predation. I've seen men who might have been him in Charleston and Memphis and Durham. Different faces maybe, or maybe I just can't remember his features correctly anymore. The magic of the 3 elegant spells might have that effect, blurring the details of the threat until you can't quite recall why you were afraid. What haunts me isn't what Everett did. It's how appealing his offer was. In my worst moments, when the noise in my head gets overwhelming and I can't remember why I'm supposed to care about continuing this exhausting performance of being myself, I understand why 23 people accepted his help, why they traded their messy, painful autonomy for elegant, peaceful obedience. The 3 spells weren't evil because they hurt people. They were evil because they offered something a suffering person desperately wants, and the cost was only visible after you'd already paid it. Sometimes I wonder if Detective Compton is happy in that industrial kitchen. If the divorced guy and the notebook woman and the lost college kid found something like contentment in whatever purpose Everett and Fenwick assigned them. If peace without consciousness is still peace, and whether that's a trade some people should be allowed to make. But then I remember Cheryl Hastings, that moment when she'd returned the coin and briefly become human again before Everett's magic pulled her back under. The look on her face, confused and disoriented but alive in a way she hadn't been while under the spell's influence. That looked like someone who'd made a bargain she didn't fully understand, and when she'd glimpsed what she'd lost, the horror had been absolute. So I keep moving. Keep tending bar in different cities, keep listening to people's problems, keep watching for that particular configuration of charm and emptiness that marks someone who's learned the 3 elegant spells. And I keep my hands away from strange coins, mysterious cards, folded papers offered by helpful strangers. Because once you've seen how elegantly evil can dress itself up, how beautifully it can offer to end your suffering, you understand that the real magic isn't in the spells themselves. The real magic is in maintaining the courage to keep struggling, keep choosing, keep carrying the burden of your own consciousness, even when someone offers to take it away forever. That's the hardest spell to cast, and it's one you have to renew every single day. Have you ever been offered an elegant solution that seemed too good to be true? Ever felt that pull toward someone promising to take away the confusion and give you clarity, purpose, certainty? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone. And who knows, maybe recognizing these patterns is how we protect ourselves from them. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, real stories from my 2 decades behind bars across America, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story if you dare.